session with Martin Wolf. Well, he's been honored with the Commander of the British Empire for his services to financial journalism. Lawrence Summers has called him the world's preeminent financial journalist. Mohammed Al Ryan, former CEO of PIMCO, has called him by far the most influential economic columnist of this world. And Prospect Magazine has called him the Anglosphere's most influential financial journalist. I rest my case. He's here with us at Business Standard Manthan. To steer this session, I have with me on stage the editor of Business Standard, Shailesh Dobhal, who will now take forward this session. Shailesh, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mr. Wolf.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'll just stop this for the moment so we can see me.
Yes.
I'm very pleased to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us for Business Standard Manthan. This is a two-day event that we are holding to celebrate Business Standard entering its 50th year. Mr. Wolf, we've already done the introduction. He's the chief economics commentator for Financial Times. And today, Mr. Wolf is going to present on Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. Over to you, Mr. Wolf.
So, first of all, thank you very much. I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you. I always love my trips to India. I will, in fact, be going to India in July, but that doesn't help now. My session is not very long, but let me explain what I'm going to be talking about. This is a book that has just come out. And I hope you can see my PowerPoint presentation now. It's a book that I have just published a year ago. It's called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And for me, it's the first book I've written with a profoundly political theme. And this reflects events in the world, but particularly events in the high-income Western democracies. Indeed, I wrote another column on this subject this very morning about the return to our world of what are essentially, but in changed form, fascist tropes, fascist way of thinking about things. And I think they are a serious threat to our political system and our political stability. In this book and in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the Western world. I don't have enough time to talk about the wider implications, except to a small degree. I'm going to start, if I may, with a quotation, which in a way is was my guiding point in deciding what I was going to say. And the quotation, I will explain who it's from, is from one of the two great intellectual founders of Western philosophy. This is Aristotle, the second after Plato, who lived in, though he wasn't actually Athenian, who lived in ancient Athens in the 4th century before Christ. And he was a polymath who wrote on absolutely everything that one can imagine, a quite extraordinary intellectual figure. But among other things, he was one of the two founders of political science. After Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics is the second most important book. And I discovered in it, when I started to write on my book, a truly remarkable sentence, which I'm going to quote to you. And it's about what makes a democracy stable, a democratic polity stable. And he said, "It is clear then that the best partnership in a state is the one which operates through the middle people," by which he meant the middle classes. And also that those states in which this middle element, the middle class, is large and stronger, if possible, than the other two together, by which he meant both the very rich and the really poor, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run democratic constitution. So he was saying, I think before anybody else, that a stable democracy requires a stable, contented, independent middle class. It's a necessary condition in the long run for its functioning. Now, to explain why I specifically wrote this book, I start my book with a little bit of personal history, which may be of some interest here. Though our story is one of many stories in the middle of the 20th century of horrible human catastrophes, as of course happened in India with partition. In 1937, my father left Vienna for England. He was on his own. His immediate family managed by a miracle to escape to Palestine in 39. Their wider family was stuck in Poland, and apart from one young woman, they all perished in the Holocaust. In May 1940, my mother's father, a self-made Jewish fish merchant, hijacked a trawler in order to take his family to England as the German armies poured across the Dutch frontier. He was one of nine. He asked all his brothers and sisters to join him with their families. None came. Their families also all perished in the Holocaust. I am not, to tell the truth, certain of the numbers, but somewhere between 40 and 50 of my parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins were slaughtered. And I was born in 1946, so this happened just before my birth. This was, of course, the result of the complete collapse of civilization in Europe. There were, in my view, many reasons for this collapse, but crucial among them was economic failure, particularly the great hyperinflations of the early 20s and the Great Depression of the 30s. These were what brought Hitler to power. And my conclusion is that if people cannot gain a decent and secure standard of living, a peaceful and stable democratic order becomes very hard to sustain. And that is why the theme of my book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which I began as Donald Trump became president of the US in 2016, seized me. I'm definitely not saying what happened then will happen again. I'm saying that one must never assume the stability of a liberal democracy. And now let me tell you a little bit after that introduction with what I'm going to talk about. I'll go back. I'm going to start. I've already talked about what motivated me to write this book. Then I'm going to talk about the Democratic Recession as a global phenomenon. Then I'm going to talk about how democratic capitalism was born. I'll then talk about the state of the high-income democracies and what went wrong, particularly in their economies. And finally, I'll talk briefly about democratic capitalism in the world. So let me start then with the Democratic Recession. Remember this, in a liberal democracy, that is a democracy characterized by individual civil rights, the rule of law, and respect for both the rights of the losers and the legitimacy of the winners, fair elections determine who holds power. Attempts by a head of government and state to subvert the election or overturn the vote are obviously treason to this political order. Yet that is exactly what Donald Trump attempted to do both before and after the last presidential elections. He failed. Decent and brave people ensured that. But to this day, Trump continues to hold the loyalty of his party's base. He could very well be the next president of the US. It's probably a 50-50 shot. Meanwhile, true conservative stalwarts, such as Liz Cheney, were thrown out of the party. Her crime, simply stating that Trump's big lie, that the outcome of the election was a lie, is itself a big lie. Yet how can a democracy survive if people take their very perception of political reality from their leader? The US is, alas, far from alone. Freedom in the World 2023, from the very well-known independent US watchdog Freedom House, which was published in February 2023, reported a 17th consecutive year of decline in the health of liberal democracy. The Democratic Recession, noted by Larry Diamond of Stanford and the Hoover Institution, one of the world's great scholars of democracy, more than 1.5 decades ago, is now coming close to a democratic depression. This decline has occurred in all regions of the world, but it is also observable in core Western democracies, including the US. And what happens if it abandons core norms of liberal democracy? Where would this leave the future of liberal democracy worldwide? Let me just show you one chart on this, which comes from the Freedom House report, and it shows, in their estimates, the decline in what they think of as political freedom in a whole range of countries in the last 10 years up to 2023. And you can see that the US, and I'm afraid India, I won't comment on that further, are in this list, though their declines are smaller, of course. But you can see a very large list of countries, including countries like Turkey, Egypt, Thailand, and so forth, have suffered very large declines in democracy and in the quality of their democracy. And there are almost no countries where it's increased. So with that, let me move on to the next subject, which is, well, how did democratic capitalism happen in the first place? How did this system emerge at all? According to one of the most famous databases on democracy, there were no democracies at all 2 centuries ago. Even when republican institutions did exist, the franchise was hugely restricted on the grounds of sex, race, and wealth. And of course, I'm not even considering here all the countries that were parts of empires and had no political rights at all. Then, in a few countries in the 19th century, franchises began to be widened and universal suffrage democracy emerged, and it spread in fits and starts, including in a huge number of newly independent countries in the second half of the 20th century, to cover half of the world's countries after 1990, before declining once again in this democratic recession that I've mentioned. This did not happen everywhere, but it happened in enough important countries to change the world. By this, in this case, I mean the extension of democracy. So why did democracy become increasingly normal? In fact, roughly half the world's countries are now democratic, to some degree democratic. Remember that the normal way to structure the economies and politics of post-agrarian societies has been for power to belong to wealth and wealth to belong to power. The most powerful people in society were the richest, by and large, and vice versa. Absolute monarchs tended effectively to own everything. So why did the revolutionary change towards democracy occur? The answer, I suggest, lies with the emergence of a marriage between a liberal economy and a democratic polity. Market capitalism and democracy are, I argue in my book, complementary opposites. A market economy and universal suffrage democracy both reject ascribed hereditary status. They embrace the idea that people are entitled to decide important things for themselves. Market capitalism rests on ideals of free labor, individual effort, reward for merit, and of course the rule of law. Democracy rests on ideals of free discussion and debate among citizens when making those laws. Historically, the market economy also brought with it urbanization, a need for a more educated workforce, crucial in my view, the emergence of an organized working class as a political force, and as well as, crucially, an opportunity for a positive sum form of politics. In countries as they get richer, everybody can be made better off if politics works properly. Democracies also rest on the existence of an economically independent citizenry. That was Aristotle's crucial point. A fully socialist society is inevitably a dictatorship, since the ownership of productive assets is vested almost entirely in the state. In the absence of coordination through genuinely competitive markets, the state must be responsible for the allocation of those resources. This then creates a centralization of power and a huge incentive for politicians not to lose it. Thus, markets protect democratic politics from an excessive concentration of power, and democratic politics protects markets from an excessive concentration of wealth. This then is how the market economy and liberal democracy are complementary. Yet, as I've argued, they are also opposites. Capitalism tends to be cosmopolitan. It goes cross borders. The democratic state is territorial. The market is the domain of exit. Democracy is the domain of voice. The market economy can be inegalitarian, $1, one vote. Democracy is egalitarian. The principle is one person, one vote. Tensions between capitalism and democracy will therefore inevitably emerge. If the economy fails to serve the interests of the majority, the sense of shared citizenship will fray, and populist demagogues are likely to emerge. Populism is not necessarily lethal for democracy, so long as it takes the form of an often justified hostility to certain elites. But too often it takes the form of hostility to pluralism, which is an essential, inescapable element indeed in any democracy. Democracy may then be transformed into a plebiscitary dictatorship. Alternatively, the concentration of wealth will lead to plutocracy, as wealth is once again transmuted into power. So now let me move to my next section, which is on what's going on in high-income countries. Large rises in inequality and the deteriorating prospects of the old respectable working and middle classes in core democracies have, I argue at length, weakened the foundations of our democracies. In particular, fear of downward mobility has created status anxiety and cynicism, particularly among the old working class. These then have been diverted by right-wing propagandists into cultural and racial resentment, especially in our more ethnically diverse societies. The emergence of the new media has facilitated these trends, but in my view, they have not created them. A big question is what happened to create this status anxiety, especially in people who did not go to college. In the long run, I argue the most important phenomena have been economic, that is deindustrialization, falling productivity growth, and the terrible shock of the global financial crisis. So with that, let me move on to my next chart. So this chart shows deindustrialization in major Western countries. And you can see that back in 1970, industry was the dominant source of employment for a huge part of the labor force. Predominantly, this was obviously male jobs, working class jobs. And as you can see, by 2019, 50 years later, there was a dramatic decline, had been a dramatic decline in the share of jobs created by industry, and with it, the collapse of the old industrial areas. Many of these are the areas which have been voting for Brexit, for Donald Trump, in East Germany for the Alternative for Deutschland, and so forth. These are a very important source of the populist right. And you can see these declines have occurred across the whole Western world, particularly in the UK, but also in Germany and France. It's a very profound change. The second crucial change is that essentially our societies have gone ex-growth. As countries like China and now India are growing much faster, we are growing much more slowly. So this chart shows decadal average growth rate of output per hour of employed people in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. And you can see there was a dramatic decline in the last period. And that, of course, has underpinned extremely slow rates of growth of living standards, which has combined with deindustrialization to make a very large portion of the labor force think of themselves as worse off, absolutely, or at least relatively. And then Raghuram Rajan, the former governor of the Reserve Bank, argued in a book he published in about 2010 that we allowed easy credit to disguise these adverse trends. But that solution blew up in the financial crisis. The scale and visibility of the crisis and the subsequent rescue of the banks and bankers also convinced a very large part of the population that the elites were both incompetent and corrupt. It destroyed the respectability of traditional elites, particularly actually on the right, where the Republican business elite was substantially reduced in its influence. And I think that's one of the reasons we can now see the rise of Trump to replace somebody like Mitt Romney, who was candidate in 2010. And so the Republicans became ripe for a populist takeover. Now, the shift towards skill-intensive sectors and technologies, deindustrialization, as I mentioned, globalization, the rise of China and other emerging economies were part of the reason this happened. But there is also substantial evidence, in my view, I argue this at length, of the emergence of forms of rentier capitalism, with declining competition, rising monopoly, and unbridled self-seeking among corporate executives. And the role of money in politics, especially in the US, eroded the tax base and to some degree the effectiveness of regulation. These economic phenomena then, I think, greatly worsened the confidence people had in the political system. And here in this last chart I show what happened to GDP per head in, again, the major developed countries after the financial crisis. So each point, as it were, is the proportional deviation of GDP per head relative to what it would have been if GDP per head had continued to rise on the 1990 to 2007 trend line. And you can see, if we leave aside, in every case, the output per head was now in 21. This is far below the pre-crisis trend, but in some cases the shortfall is dramatic. In countries like Spain, UK, and Italy, the shortfalls were 30% of GDP per head below trend by 2021. I mean, just a staggering shortfall from the previous trend. Even in the US, it was close to 20%. The same was true for France. Only in Germany and Japan was the shortfall from the previous trend relatively modest. So the financial crisis turned out to be a major turning point in the economic history of the developed world, and this has not yet ended. So that is where we are, and I think very briefly why I think there's such a political problem in our societies. Now, my final section is just to discuss a bit about how democratic capitalism fits into the world. In a really remarkable book, Branko Milanovic, a former colleague, former official at the World Bank, argues that capitalism is alone. It has won. Yet the crucial question is, what sort of capitalism won? Is it what Milanovic calls liberal capitalism and I would call democratic capitalism? Or is it what he calls political capitalism and I would call authoritarian capitalism? In the contemporary world, there are in fact two forms of authoritarian capitalism. The most common version derives from a takeover of democracies from within. The would-be autocrat eats out the political system from inside. Usually he starts as a populist demagogue, and features of such regimes, of which there are very many, include a narrow circle of trusted servants loyal to the leader, promotion of members of the family, and members of the power ministries, the army, the security services, the judicial ministries, who are appointed because they are personally loyal to the leaders. Plutocrats may find it necessary to support the leader Ultimately, however, they usually are forced to survive as his cronies. The other big challenger is what I call bureaucratic authoritarian capitalism, the Chinese system. It has turned out, to our surprise, that a communist bureaucracy operating a capitalist economy can be reasonably self-disciplined, long-sighted, technocratic, and rational. Even so, this form of capitalism also suffers from many of the vices of authoritarianism, especially the tendency towards corruption and crony capitalism. Indeed, Xi Jinping himself has said this. These failings threaten both the economy and political legitimacy. This form of capitalism, because it's the Chinese system, is indeed a significant challenger to Western democratic capitalism. Yet, in my view, we should not despair. Autocracies remain defective systems. They do not have a clear structure of accountability. They do not have open debate. They cannot ensure a peaceful transfer of power, and they tend in times towards cronyism and corruption. Indeed, corruption too often becomes the system, the entire system. So in sum, I think we are in a period of profound challenge for liberal democracy and its relationship with the market economy. It's not clear what will happen, but I'm reminded that it has come through many challenges over the past century, and it survived. And I hope and believe it will continue to survive. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf, for such a thought-provoking and incisive lecture. I'm sure this audience has lots of takeaways. Would you, Mr. Wolf, you're there? Yeah, we can take 2-3 questions from the audience. Please identify yourself and ask the question. Yeah, the gentleman over there. Yeah.
Sir, good afternoon. Am I audible, please?
I can hear you.
Very interesting presentation. The only thought that I felt like sharing with you was on the opening slide, where Aristotle says the middle element should be large, but goes on to say it should be stronger. I feel the word which is appropriate is larger, which would mean that the middle element or the middle class becoming larger, inclusion becoming, spread out, will be support for liberal democracy. Strength has got other connotations, which actually this conversation is trying to, speak against. That was my thought. Thanks.
I haven't read I believe it or not, I can read Greek, and I haven't gone back to look at the original text, but I agree with your sentiment. It is worth remembering, in addition, the crucial element in explaining what happened in ancient Greece, that the population at large were the soldiers. So if you didn't keep the middle class pretty happy, yeah, well, they were the soldiers. But I think your main point is right. The development in a successful democratic capitalist society does depend on creating a large, educated middle class. The economic development depends on that, and so does political stability. And I think that is a universal law. It applies in India. It applies everywhere else. And the decline of the middle classes, or the failure of it to emerge successfully, is a huge problem for both economic progress and the stability of the politics.
Yeah, Mr. Sharma?
Yeah.
Mr. Wolf, we have a question for you from Mr. Shankar Sharma.
Yeah, Mr. Wolf. I have a question which is more fundamental, that why is the assumption that a democratic structure itself is the right form, and that we are trying to find arguments that why it should continue to be the right form? Because isn't that a construct of the Western economies, which has been not seen in other parts of the world, in large parts of the world, be it Asia or Africa or even Latin America? Why are we assuming that that is the order that is right, and should be continued to hold I mean, held in like some haloed form that this is the standard everybody should aspire to. Is it that that was a time in the world when that was popular and it has faded away to be replaced by what was natural to the world, which is to be run by kings, kingdoms, autocrats, ideologues, demagogues?
So my answer to that is indeed the core of my book, and I have long sections to discuss this, and I've only summarized it very briefly. My argument would be twofold. I mean, we could start an hour-long discussion. The evidence from the kings, warlords, and all the rest of it, and the evidence I provide in my book on this is absolutely compelling, is that they governed overwhelmingly in their own interests. And almost with exceptions, the society they ruled were as unequal as it was possible for them to be without killing off the peasantry on whom they depended. And furthermore, if you look at the history of the economy, these societies were economically nearly stagnant. So progress started with liberal capitalism, which emerged out of the rule of law in crucial ways, which already was a profound constraint on kings. And it emerged further with the emergence of democracy as people at large wanted a say in their public life as they became more educated, and society more obviously depended on them. The economy itself transformed society in a way that these political demands were naturally made. So I think it was a natural and inevitable development. Now, the second point, so the first big point, basically, I think the history of autocracy is a history of extreme failure. The second point in the modern world is there have been lots of autocracies in the last 60 or 70 years. And what we know from those autocracies is the following. Autocracies obviously are systems with extreme variance in performance. And the reason for that is there are effectively very few checks and balances. So if you get a demonic dictator as your autocrat, and my God, there have been enough of them, you can end up with the murder of millions of people. And there's been plenty of those examples. Occasionally, it's really quite rare, but occasionally you get an autocrat who actually has a development strategy. I can think, for instance, of Park Chung-hee in Korea, Chiang Kai-shek, not really him, but his people work for him in Taiwan, Lee Kuan Yew, less really of an autocrat, but in Singapore, and Deng Xiaoping in China. These are really rare freaks. In two of those cases, Taiwan and Korea, as the people got more educated, more demanding, better informed, they basically demanded democracy, and the economy has continued to do very well. And these are, I would argue, Korea and Taiwan are the most successful countries economically in the last 70, economically and politically in the last 70 years. Again, reinforcing the general point, which is that the world's richest countries and hitherto most stable polities are prosperous capitalist democracies. Whether China will sustain its movement forward under the much stronger dictatorship of Xi Jinping is very debatable. My suspicion is it won't. So I think your autocracies are inherently failing systems. They have inadequate internal checks and balances. Too often the autocrat starts off or becomes, like Putin, a psychopathic maniac, and you can't get rid of him. And so I don't think it's just arbitrary Western imposition. I think this is simply a better system than any other in the long run. Yeah. If you can find a supremely competent, generous-minded, intelligent, civilized autocrat and guarantee that his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be similarly, then I think that is a very good system. But Indian experience, and you've had some good dynasties, shows pretty clearly that's not how it ends up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. We have one last question, Mr. Wolf. Mr. Jakar there.
Fine.
Please,
Fine.
one last question.
in the developed world, farmers are in distress and are protesting in Europe, in America, everywhere. Is it because markets don't work for agriculture produce?
No, I think not. We don't really have markets for agricultural produce. These are the most rigged markets we have. And that's because they are designed to support the incomes of farmers. And because farming is such a tiny part of our economy, we've been able to afford that at rather a generous level. Farmers, as I think Indians know too, are rather good at protesting, and sometimes maybe they have a legitimate cause. In this case, so far as I can understand it, the dominant issue is the desire to, quote unquote, green farming. That is to say, reduce the emissions, CO2 emissions associated with farming. That's been the biggest source of protest. And here I feel that that politicians made quite a big mistake. They didn't realize how this would affect farmers. It wasn't a really high priority. The emissions from farming are pretty small compared to the emissions from other sectors in our economies. And they didn't work out a much better path for dealing with this. But I would point out that we've been having protests from farmers as a small community which no longer feels that we pay adequate attention to them. It's such a small part of our population. Quite frequently, this is not going to be the source of our political breakdown. It's far more likely to be the disappointed old industrial working class, a much bigger segment of our population, and the disappointed university-educated young in a slow-growing economy that will be and has been the source of protest from the right, which I talked about here, but also to some degree the left. And the essential point I would make is every society, whatever its political order, has to find a way of accommodating and dealing with the protests of those who feel they're not being looked after properly. Unfortunately, autocrats tend to deal with this first by shooting people until it starts exploding. In democracies, the protests are on the street, which is a good thing. Politicians have to respond, which is a good thing. And in my view, if that's done intelligently, that is the way societies accommodate themselves to change, to the dissatisfaction of their people, because they are allowed to protest. And that means that politicians have to respond to those protests. And that's how a society based on freedom and consensus can function. And indeed, it's the only way such a society can function. So to me, when people are protesting like this, I think it's terrific. That's exactly what I want to see in my society. Because if you suppress it, it doesn't disappear. It just means it will blow up later on in possibly even worse away. So thank God for protesting farmers.
Yeah. A big round of applause for Mr. Wolf. Thank you, Mr. Wolf, for joining us from London. It was a really eye-opening session. Your prognosis that democracy...
Tremendous honor and pleasure. And I think these are stupendously important issues everywhere. But I remain a passionate believer, perhaps for the reasons I said in my beginning, in the great virtues of freedom.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.